If you have particularly traumatic experiences, intense experiences around violence, emergency situations, being trapped, terror situations, like stressful situations, to sit with those feelings, in theory, you're sitting there and you're creating space for them and it's a lovely experience and you're very calm. But often your body doesn't know that that's a very calming, safe experience. To sit there and to deliberately look at it can re-traumatize people.
Hey everyone, before we get into this week's podcast, we got a pretty cool announcement to make. You are now able to connect with us. We have a pretty cool little widget that's on the website. Just go to paultaylor.biz/podcast. And near the top of the page, you'll see a little icon that says send a message to the Paul Taylor podcast. So what we can do with that, you just click on that and then you send us an audio message and we will get the audio message. Now, the first thing I want to do with using it is actually do an Ask Me Anything episode. So all you got to do if you got a question that you want me to cover is just go to paultaylor.biz/podcast, hit on start the recording, and then send us a message about what you would like me to talk about in the Ask Me Anything and leave your name. We will call it out on the show. I'll get that all put together. And the other thing you can do is just leave us a message about what you like about the podcast, what you don't like about the podcast. Do I talk too much? All of that sort of stuff. And just give us some feedback. And we will use that to continuously improve. So looking forward to hearing from you. Now, on with the podcast. Megan Flamer, welcome to the podcast.
Lovely to be here.
Now, you have a pretty eclectic background, I think we should say. So you kind of a journalist by trade and broadcasting and a bit of a jazz singer as well. And now
I'm in the shower now a little bit, but yes.
Right. So talk us through that background before we get into what you're doing now.
Yes. So I studied broadcasting at the Western Australia Academy of Performing Arts and then started working for the ABC when I was reasonably young. So spent sort of 10, 15 years working in and around the ABC and working, as an emergency services broadcaster. I covered a lot of bushfires and international emergencies. And I was one of the journalists who covered the Black Saturday bushfires.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was working for local radio. I'd also been working for a program called The Country Hour. So regional and rural Australia, and was quite involved with those communities that were affected and also quite traumatized by the experience of it. And I was already what I like to call hippie adjacent when that happened. I'd done my yoga. I'd done my yoga teacher training. I was doing, my mindfulness teacher training and was really interested in that area. And then realized when it kind of came down to it, not that you can't sort of take yourself off in an emergency situation or a fire situation to take a quiet few moments. But in the case of PTSD, mindfulness meditation can often be contraindicated as well. So I found that the things that I'd been using to support my stress relief and stress management suddenly didn't work for me. And so I got really obsessed with what actually works for people when they've had traumatic pasts or, are in current really difficult situations, and became really obsessed by that question. And then have spent the last 15 years kind of exploring that, like working with people who are in really stressful environments, have really intense or stressful jobs in Asia, in the US, and then back here in Australia. I moved back here in 2018 after a decade overseas.
And you spent a bit of time in Silicon Valley, didn't you?
Yeah. So I was based out of San Francisco. So I guess I went via Asia. So 2009 was the bushfires. And then that same year, I moved up to Bangkok and I was working as a journalist up there and started a company there where I was, kind of exploring these things, looking at mindfulness and how to de-stress people as well as one can I think with retreats, what I was hoping is people would come and have these transformative experiences, and then they'd go back to their lives all transformed. And I realized very quickly, you go and you have the transformative experience, and then you go back to life as it is. Like, there's still life and bills and all the city things. And so I spent a lot of time over the next 5 years traveling around the world and teaching these retreats, but noticing more and more again that people are not really connecting with the practices of well-being in their normal lives. They're not figuring out how they can apply those in everyday life. It's more we're taking a week out and we're escaping and going somewhere beautiful and sunny in the jungle. And then you kind of go back to business as usual. And so part of me moving to San Francisco was people starting to talk to me more about, like, what would this look like in an organization? How do we start making those shifts? And I got really lucky when I first moved to San Francisco. I was working with a company that does game design, and I met a few people who were working at Google, and they were looking for someone to come and give a talk about, kind of journalists who have to look at traumatic images. And a lot of these lawyers that they had at Google were looking at traumatic images as they were teaching algorithms. This is kind of early days, like 2013, 2014.
Right.
And so these lawyers are kind of, looking at this information, and they're quite disturbed by it. And so I gave a talk there, and then they became one of my first clients, which was really great.
It's a pretty good first client.
It was a pretty good first client. I got very lucky. And it was completely, I often complain about this in Australia. Like, I noticed in the US, you'd be at a party or you'd be just at a cafe or something, and you'd talk to someone about something, and they'd say, I know someone that we could connect you with, or I reckon you should talk to this guy. It's like this very, very, very generous networking kind of culture. It never felt fake or transactional to me in that way. It just felt enormously helpful, especially as some, yoga teacher journo who rocked up there as an organizational designer, not really knowing 100% what I was doing. So I got really lucky with the people that I got to meet. And then started doing that. I actually started a company over in the States that was Mindful Under Fire, and then was based there until 2018, so nearly 5 years doing that kind of work.
So tell me, why does the traditional, so you said that the traditional sort of mindfulness stuff, when you've been through really hard experiences, is suboptimal or often doesn't work. Why is that?
I'm not I'm a mental health first aider, but I'm not a mental health professional. So I'm always careful of what I, recommend and say there. But in my personal experience, and certainly with groups that I've worked with who specialize in PTSD, if you think about what it is to be in a meditation or a mindfulness experience, is focusing on and paying attention to what's happening in your mind, what's happening in your body, sitting with and noticing what's going on as you're sitting there. If you have particularly traumatic experiences, intense experiences around violence, emergency situations, being trapped, terror situations, like any of those things. I've worked a lot with people from prisons, for example, like really intense lockdown, stressful situations where you're, in something where you are in physical danger. To sit with those feelings, in theory, you're sitting there and you're creating space for them, and it's a lovely experience and you're very calm. But often your body doesn't know that that's a very calming, safe experience. To sit there and to deliberately look at it can re-traumatize people. For me personally, thinking about being in a bushfire situation, sitting there and, imagining what it felt like to be in that space, imagining the smells and being with that, I'm now able to do that, but this is like, more than a decade later.
With the benefit of all of that distance and the emotional intensity reducing. Yeah. So I can see how in and of the moment, revisiting that and trying to sit with it can be counterproductive for quite a lot of people.
Yes, especially early on. And I'd already been someone who would meditate and been into all this stuff for over a decade when I came to it. When those situations happened. So it wasn't that I wasn't already an experienced meditator, but I started to learn different ways of dealing with it. I did some interesting different alternative therapies, and that helped a lot. For me, the physicality of things helped. So things like shaking.
Moving your body. Yeah.
Yep. Like tapping. Tapping was one of those things that at the beginning I hated, and I was like, this is so stupid. Please don't make me do this. And it was actually really helpful. Physical anchors, breath work. I mean, I was already a yoga teacher, so a lot of that, like noticing things arise and moving through them. So I got pretty experimental. I mean, I treated myself as my own guinea pig and spent a lot of time working with that. And now, there will be times when I will deliberately put myself back into thinking about situations that have been traumatizing or upsetting, and I'll spend some time.
Tell me this: did you ever do, when you were experimenting with those different therapies? You talked about tapping, which I'm familiar with. Do you ever do EMDR?
Yes, yeah. So
Because that's really interesting. There's actually a bucket load of research around it, and
yes,
now understood mechanisms by how it works.
yes, yeah. So that was one of the early things that I tried even before I left Australia, and at the time hated it. Like really was like, again, it felt a bit like the tapping. It's like, what is this? And I think I was impatient. I was really highly strung about all of it as well. It's just like, I just need to find something that works. One of the things that I did, I guess, somewhat illegally, I worked with a psychotherapist from the Netherlands who was in Thailand, and he did EMDR using MDMA as well.
Ah, so you're an early proponent of the, because there's actually a bucket load of research around that, and I interviewed a guy a few weeks ago, Paul, with an unpronounceable surname, who is the lead researcher in psychedelic assisted therapy in Australia. I think he's connected to, is it Monash or Deacon? I can't quite remember which one he's connected to.
Oh, Paul Litnitsky.
Yes, the
He's
very
amazing.
man.
He's at Monash. Yes.
Yes, yeah, he's incredible. I did a talk with him. We were both doing a talk at the YPO, the Young Presidents Organization. Yeah, his stuff was absolutely mind blowing. I got really my interest was piqued in this 20 odd years ago when I was in the Amazon jungle with a shaman taking ayahuasca, going on an ayahuasca journey, and mine was exploration. But there were a couple of people there, one who was a heroin addict and one who was an alcoholic, who said they had tried everything and nothing worked anything like the ayahuasca. And so, that ability of psychedelics to reset the brain. And Paul describes it as a rocket ship for therapy. So it really...
I have different, I mean, look, I definitely think Paul is an incredible practitioner, and I love that people are exploring these different modalities now. Like I've certainly guinea pigged myself from that first experience with this Dutch psychotherapist, which honestly completely changed my relationship with, like even smelling smoke. It completely changed. I was like, oh, just having no triggers or reactions. And that was after just a few sessions with him. And then went on to do many therapies. I spent a lot of time in Mexico and Guatemala and Belize working with shamans.
Okay.
Most of 2010, 11 and 12. Because also as a musician, you would know the ayahuasca tradition is very musically based. So I spent a lot of time traveling around with some musicians and shamans, which was really beautiful. And
it's a conversation I wasn't expecting to have when we were talking about mindfulness and contemplative.
Me either. I don't usually talk about this. But I noticed that a lot of people, I mean, I do a lot of work with the startup community, for example, and it's a really popular conversation, certainly in Silicon Valley about 5-10 years ago. And as often the case in Australia, it's currently a big conversation with people talking about, psychedelic assisted therapy and also
and microdosing.
And also just like psychedelics, because we're expanding our minds. The one thing I really noticed though, I had done a lot of work on self-inquiry and self-discovery, and I had quite strong practices around mindfulness, meditation, and integration practices when I came to these psychedelic therapies. And I've noticed that folks who have done a bit of that self-inquiry work, whether it's just even having a basic mindfulness practice or a meditation practice or just any kind of self-inquiry, maybe you're someone who journals, just having those practices in place before you start playing with the big stuff,
Yes.
I think is really important, because I often will come across, say, startup founders who have never meditated, and they'll go and try and do a 10-day Vipassana retreat, like a non-speaking, intense Vipassana retreat, or they'll go and spend 2 weeks in the Amazon doing ayahuasca, or they'll go and, do LSD trips, trying to emulate Hunter S. Thompson in the jungle, whatever. Like, I'm all for the exploration, and I think you've got to have some building blocks in place, because I've also seen those things have poor effects. And I've usually seen them have poor effects with people who just don't have that sort of self-inquiry practice and don't have some of those basics in place before they start exploring.
I can completely attest to this. I did an ayahuasca ceremony. There was a Spanish kid who'd never even smoked a cigarette, and never had a drink, never had a joint, never had done anything. And somebody just told him he should go and do an ayahuasca ceremony. And he almost lost his mind on that ceremony.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's work. It's not, it's not like going to a rave or something. Like, it's work. It's, you're working through things. I mean, in the yogic tradition, we talk about like burning through samskaras, like getting to the deeper levels of your soul, of your psyche, of really understanding who you are and who you are in the universe and who the universe is in you. And I mean, these are massive experiences, but if you don't really have a context for already who you might be in the universe, what that feels like, I think it would just feel terrifying.
Yes, and this is what it was like for him, and it took like 5 or 6 hours, and then all I heard was like, "Sí, claro, which is, it's all clear, but he was almost losing his mind. I think you do have to go into these things having done some either work on yourself or consciousness exploration, and go in with a sense of intention. I think that is really, really important. And did you find then, having had that background in mindfulness and then having the psychedelic therapies, did it influence your view of mindfulness? Did it deepen it? Did it change it? Did it accelerate it? Was there any interaction that you found?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for me, the meditation practice is kind of like the gym work, like it's like the muscle building. And then a lot of my experiences with ayahuasca ceremonies were, of being the watcher, like
Yes.
you
Yeah.
watching me, watching you,
Yeah.
And so to already have an experience with that, and to already have muscles in that area, I feel like that gave me a sort of a way to cope with it. I also feel like having physical practices around it, like enormous feelings coming up and visions and, downloads, however people like to describe it. I also just feel like it's different for most people, even how they describe it and how they interact with it. But, you're getting these big downloads, to be able to just sit with discomfort, to be able to sit with, whoa, that's an interesting thought, to be able to observe that happening to your mind and your body, and to be in that as a witness is also some of the most beautiful experiences of my life, but also incredibly telling, like I've resolved enormous things in that couple of years in those ceremonies, and, and really feel like I learned so much about myself and discovered a lot of peace in myself and in things that have happened in my life. And I think it was a very, very beautiful gift. So I think also the cultural tradition of it, like I loved being able to do it in Central America, and to, be working with these beautiful shamans, and they invited me into this tradition, and, that felt really sacred and very beautiful. And so I also struggle a little bit with people just like having a swig and going to the beach with their mates in Byron,
I could not agree more. I've had people invite me to ayahuasca ceremonies over here in Australia, and I just point blank refuse, because I've done probably over 10 in the Amazon, but most of mine were very deep in the Amazon with real bona fide shamans, not the ayahuasca tourism that's going on now. And it's that connection to spirit and the plants
it's part of the whole experience. And I actually felt that it was a pretty sacred experience. So I'm completely with you. I just would not touch it here in Australia just for, these people are just going and doing it for shits and giggles. Go and take LSD if you want to do that. But for me, the plant stuff and the just the interaction with the ayahuasca vine and the chikungunya leaf, right? It's mind boggling how those two combinations. And I asked the shamans, how do you know of these combinations of plants that create the magic? And they said, the plants teach us, right? They've got that long history. And I said to people, going and visiting the Matsés Indians in the Amazon, they just think very differently to us. They've got a completely different view of reality. And I think, whether you're going there to resolve some stuff, whether it's drug addiction or trauma, or you're just, as I was, going in for consciousness exploration, I think really respecting the environment and who's doing it and why you're doing it, I think that's hugely important.
Yes. Yeah. And respecting the long and beautiful tradition of it as well, the culture of it. We have to colonize everything. But I also, I think not only did the tradition of it, but making sure that it is that integrative process. Yes, you are involved with it. The music for me was a huge part of those journeys. I did quite a few ceremonies over those years, and the music for me became such a part of who I am. This drawing it out, the sweetness of different instruments and the gift of the musicians, the service of it. I think we often think about it as I'm sitting here on my cushion, or I'm lying in this little cot and I'm involved with this, this mind-bending experience, whatever that is. But the kind of rules of it and the absolute beautiful service of the people who hold the space and hold the circle, who play the instruments, who are involved in the process. I think we sometimes kind of miss that is part of it. I'm obsessed with this ritual, the service and the ritual and the design of how that has just arisen naturally in that culture, and how that has become such a part of the ceremony, and why that's such an important and integral part of the ceremony.
No, that was a very interesting, unplanned rabbit hole that we went into. We should probably bring this conversation back to mindfulness and mindfulness at work. Very interesting as it was. But you're director of innovation at the Center for Contemplative Studies at Monash. So talk to us about the interaction between mindfulness and innovation.
Yes. Well, so we call it M3CS because it's the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies, which is a long title. But M3CS exists to bring the wisdom traditions to life. So we're ostensibly a research center, and we're looking at how we can take ancient wisdom and bring it into communities, organizations, into research, and looking at the latest consciousness research. We're looking at things like AI, we're looking at dreaming, we're looking at meditation and mindfulness, compassion, so many different facets of that. And my role with the centre is figuring out how we get that out of research and make it accessible to organisations and communities. So that's one part in, designing education design and designing programs either online. I come from this sort of startup background, so we now have a raft of courses and programs that people can access online, but also just, going out there into the community. So I give a lot of talks and get to talk a lot about the centre and run workshops and various other sort of education programs across Australia and even beyond, which is really amazing. And then, but all informed by this latest research. So really looking at, I often joke, it's like the conduit to bring more mindfulness, meditation, empathy, compassion, peak performance, resilience out of the centre and into the world.
Yeah, okay. And so you work a lot with businesses. How do you find the idea of mindfulness in the workplace? Has the acceptance of that or the openness to that, has it changed over the years since you've been doing it? And do you find it was different in the States, particularly in Silicon Valley, than it was here?
Yes, certainly. Well, so when I was a a baby yoga teacher, I used to go into like football clubs and, various different groups. Like I worked with the Australian Ballet and a bunch of other things where I'd go in and teach them mindfulness. And you'd have to sign an NDA, like where they'd be like, you can't, you've got to go in the back door, like no one's talking about it. And then, 10 years later, I came back and people like, Richmond has won a flag because, Craig Hassan, who works with me here at the centre.
Oh, Craig Hassan. Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And Emma Murray as well. Like, they've won Richmond's flag, they've done this amazing work. And so I feel like it's become much more integrated and mainstream. It's still not where it was in Silicon Valley, but also, I used to microdose with my boss in San Francisco because we were just like interested in the experiment to see how it would improve our productivity and see what would happen. That's not the sort of stuff that happens here in Australia. And generally, I think, I got pretty lucky with, with my Google connection and also with the timing of going to San Francisco. I was kind of spending more time there 2011, 2012, 2013, when Wisdom 2.0 was becoming this enormous movement over there where search inside yourself was just starting.
Did search inside yourself, did that come out of Google?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Tell our listeners about that, actually, because I've heard about that program. Yeah.
So search inside yourself was basically, I'll see if I do. I have the book here. One moment, please. Shade Meng Tang is an amazing employee at Google and was just really interested in, mindfulness and noticed that it really helped him perform and be a great employee and was really interested in it, bringing it to the organization and when it was a much smaller group. And as a result, just started like teaching them. His official title at Google for a long time was Jolly Good Fellow. A very sweet man. And just started really the scaling of programs in this sort of way. So it was one of the first, aside from John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Yes, MBSR, yeah.
Yeah. Those were two of these big programs that were sort of scaling within an organization or scaling within communities, mindfulness practices. When I say that, these are the westernized versions of that because these were originally scaled across householders all over India and, of course, like all through Southeast Asia and Zen Buddhist traditions. And this was, I guess, more of a commercial scalability, but it also, in a lot of ways, westernized and brought to people who may have been scared off by it or may have felt like it was more of a religious thing.
Yes, yeah, it's been tarnished with that brush for many years, particularly 10, 20 years ago, right? People used to think if you said mindfulness, it was a different religion.
Yes.
And so it put a lot of people off. But now I think people realize and I think that's where the consciousness and contemplative therapies or contemplative processes or whatever it's called, it makes it more open, right? Because it's away from that stigma of sitting with your legs crossed, alming away at yourself, right? There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. But then you also look at, the rise of popularity. Ram Dass is an obvious one from, that sort of 20 to 30 year ago period, but Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam and France, Pema Chodron, who's American, but, is doing all of this amazing work. And they've been people who have done such a beautiful job of translating the practices, of making them really practical for people. And I feel like people are really looking for a way to connect with these practices. And, we often joke that like Gen Xers and Gen Zers and millennials are this sort of generation of wanting to cherry pick their spirituality in these different ways. To which I say, go for it. Like read widely, just know yourself. Try and understand and know yourself. Know what works. Be looking for different practices. Cobble together what works for you. Find something that gives you peace and gives you agency and helps you feel connected with yourself and feel connected with the world.
Yeah, I totally endorse that. Read widely. I got very interested in different types of philosophies and religions when I was sort of 17, 18, then went and traveled and went and did started doing a master's in social anthropology and did one on shamanism. We did a whole unit on shamanism, and that really sparked my interest. But I think reading the different philosophical traditions, I think everybody should have to do that, right? Just to give them that breadth and that understanding of the old ancient wisdom and how it can be used today. I mean, one of the ones that's very familiar, getting away from mindfulness, but just in terms of philosophy, is the massive comeback that Stoic philosophy has actually had on people, and how it really helps people to deal with, challenges in life.
Well, so stoicism was making an enormous comeback when I was still based in San Francisco. And one of the big things I noticed, especially amongst the young male developer set, was that it was really being misunderstood and misused in that old school, stiff upper lip.
Stiff upper lip, yeah. Small S stoicism.
Exactly. Don't feel anything, squash it all down.
Yeah.
If you're a stoic, Marcus Aurelius said, it's like, no, that's not what he said at all. It's like, that's not what we're doing. So I also feel like doing all of these things in community is really important so that people can have these discussions, especially with young men. I noticed that they are having more and more discussions and starting to create more communities in Australia, for example, where they're having actual conversations about, I am having some really big feelings about this. And Stoicism is about creating space, creating agency, creating awareness, creating critical thinking. There's a lot of backlash against forcing people to do mindfulness. I think you and I would both agree, yes, wisdom traditions. We want people to look at this. We want them to examine themselves. We want them to have, great critical thinking and understand themselves. And I love the idea of making all of this available to people and, to have conversations like this where we're, letting people know that these kinds of explorations can give you a lot of peace, can give you a lot of agency, can give you tools. There are as many tools as there are different ways to explore. So try them out, guinea pig yourself a little bit. You asked before about the organizational context. I think we start getting down a little bit of a slippery slope when we're starting to look at, enforcing mindfulness, or enforcing critical thinking. There's part of me that's like, we should enforce critical thinking. But on the other hand, it's like you can lead horses to water, but we can't make them drink. We're just making these tools available to people. We're being kind and generous in offering to teach them. And people come to these things as they come to them. Might be early in life, might be late in life.
So that kind of answers my question, is how to talk to me about the process of working with organizations. So presumably the center is pulling back of all of the ancient wisdom. Are they kind of packaging it up and giving tools associated with it, and then you're going in and teaching these suite of tools in the background and saying, here's some further reading? Is that the way it works? Or
yeah, I mean, we have sort of 6 main programs that we're teaching, like mindfulness for wellbeing, peak performance. We've got maintaining a mindful life. Those are both programs designed and created by Professor Craig Hassage, the best. But we also, one of the things that we did where it was really a market-led sort of situation, I went out and spoke to hundreds and hundreds of organizations and, executives and looked at what are the key problems that you're dealing with here? What are you trying to solve in the organization? Where do you need support? And the answer was burnout. So we went and took everything that they were talking about, looking at the key issues that they've been having with their staff, with, staff turnover and issues that people are having with managing stress. And we designed a program based off that, which is a true kind of market-led offering.
I like that. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So Navigating Burnout is the name of the course. You can sign up to it online.
Right. So give our listeners, and I think that'll be a pretty bloody popular course, because burnout, it's on the rise in Australia. Is pretty shocking for it. The amount of hours that we work here are some of the highest in OECD, and we're getting big rates of burnout here. So talk us through some of the elements of the program, and particularly, 1 or 2 practical tools that people can use to help not get burnt out. Because once you're burnt out, I mean, I know all about the physiology of burnout. Once you're burnt out, it's a massive hole to climb out of. I'm all about prevention rather than cure.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think for leaders, part of it is in recognizing those behaviors in self. How are you driving yourself? How aware are you of what you're asking your team to do? How aware are you of the different ways in which your team thinks, which I think is also really powerful around the neurodiversity conversation? How do the different people in your team work well? What do they need to be supported? What does that look like? And then from a personal level, both from a leader side and from a team side, what do you need? How well do you know yourself? Do you have practices that you need support in? You need financial aid to continue with? Do the other people in your office and team know what you need in order to thrive? What does that look like? We talk a bit about human flourishing, which is one of my favorite phrases ever. I think that's a beautiful sentiment and idea. And then more broadly, it's, what can you control? What can you not control? I think we talk about those things a lot, but practically looking at how, in any given moment, how do you look at, okay, I can control this. I can't control this. Well, now what do I do with that? I'm still stressed about this. I'm still freaking out about that. So it's really a lot of exercises around creating agency for self, about perspective taking, how to step back, how to, have some wherewithal around this isn't the be all and end all of what I'm dealing with.
And this will pass. Right?
This too shall pass. Exactly. And then one of my favorite units in this program is around tech. How do you engage with tech? How do you deal with it? What are your boundaries? What's your sleep hygiene? What's your tech hygiene? Which we don't talk about enough.
Disengage with tech. I run lots of workshops around peak performance, and I'm all over sleep hygiene. And, I'm like, sleep is a weapon. And I ask people about, who's got televisions in their bedroom, and typically maybe 10 to 15% of hands will go up. I'll say, who brings a laptop or a tablet into their bedroom? And maybe it's about the same. And I'm like, who's got a mobile phone in the bedroom? 90% at least of hands go up every time. And
Absolutely.
I'm like, it's my alarm clock. And everybody laughs. And I'm like, buy a $10 alarm clock, you tight arse. Because that mobile phone beside the bed, people think that it's doing nothing. It's a friggin' attention thief. And I think the research shows the default mode network is more active when the mobile phone is beside the bed. I know Craig Hassett talks about the default mode network a lot.
Exactly. Well, even there's another researcher group here at Monash that looks at your circadian rhythms. And, even having your laptop screen, your iPad, or your phone screen at the moments when you're trying to get off to sleep, what that does, the UV of that. We talk about those special glasses that you would use and people think, oh, that looks too nerdy, I wouldn't do it. That's mucking with your sleep as well. All of that attention is drawing away from you. So it's good to, I love that this course doesn't tell you to not use tech, because I think a lot of the time we're kind of like, I know I'm not supposed to do it. It's it's not about guilt. We're looking for workability in the modern age. We're looking for how you can engage with these things, but also recognize that you're in charge. You're in charge of how much you use it. You have agency and awareness around how you use it and what that looks like. I really love that, creating real plans for yourself so that it's, you are actually in charge of whether or not you touch that phone or not. Let's get more awareness there so that you are.
So it sounds like this is much more than just the mindfulness programs. Because when people hear that, right, they're going up, they're going to come in, they're going to teach me how to meditate and, get in touch with myself. But from what we've been saying, there's lots of real practicalities about just living and working more effectively.
Yes. And I think, I keep saying awareness and agency, but I feel like those are the two things that we work with a lot. It's how do you engage with yourself? How do you know what's bothering you? I think in the case of burnout, the number of people that we speak to and the number of organizations where we'll go in and, we work a lot with emergency workers. I worked a lot with emergency workers in the US, my previous company. The amount of people who are just shocked when they hit the wall and fall in a heap. They didn't even realize that it was happening. And so the earlier we can smell that smoke, the earlier we can get at finding those practices, like noticing, oh, my eye is twitching. Like, okay, maybe that's a magnesium deficiency, or maybe you haven't slept properly in a long time and you're nearing an area that's dangerous for you and it's burnout and you're not going to be any good to yourself or to anyone else. How can we start to integrate these practices earlier? How can we be more aware earlier? How can we be looking out for each other in our teams, in our organizations, in our communities, in our families? You know, are you aware of how stressed your partner would be on a scale of 1 to 10? If you asked them, could they even tell you? Are they doing that internal temperature take, even on a daily basis? Like, where are you at stress-wise today? Okay, what relieves that pressure valve? I often use the analogy of a pool toy. You're like skimming on the surface of life, and then when things get really hot, the pool toy gets really tight, and then you spring a leak or a kid jumps on you and you burst and, you know, you sink to the bottom of the pool. But you have that valve on there, and the more knowledge that you have around what inflates you and what relieves that pressure, it's so important to just day-to-day well-being, day-to-day equilibrium, and just knowing what are the levers that you need to pull. It is different for all of us. For someone, like, you know, having a donut might be the thing. For someone else, it's a massage. For someone else, it's a walk, it's a surf, it's a, you know, really understanding what the things are that relieve that pressure for you and help inflate you again, get you back on track.
I think that self-awareness piece is really huge. There are so many people who are just sleepwalking through life, and they're sleepwalking towards burnout. And I see it all the time in the work that I do, that there's people who are really high achievers who are they're running so hot. You know, they are running like a Formula One racing car. The rev counter is just so high. And because they've been doing it for so long, it becomes normal, right? And humans will adapt to that. And you'll think that this is okay because this is just the way that it's been. And I always say to people, if you go on holidays and you get sick routinely at the start of the holiday, that's a big warning sign that you're running too hot, right? And, you know, you ask them, how long does a Formula One engine last? Not very long at all, because it's running at such high revs. But yeah, that self-awareness piece is really, really critical. So are there any particular tools that you use for people around that self-awareness, or is it more just of an education process, or a kind of a mix of those things?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it is about having, you know, as broad a toolkit as possible so that you can be trying things out for yourself. You know, one of the big things we talk about will be things like caffeine and alcohol. You know, like I'll notice, for example, if I don't get enough sleep, then the next morning I'll want to have a bit of extra coffee. And then because I've had a bit of extra coffee, I'll find it harder to wind down at the end of the day. So I might have an extra glass of wine. Then my sleep is disturbed.
Then your stress levels go up. Then you tend to eat more shit food, right? You're less likely to exercise.
More caffeine, more alcohol, da. So you start to see how the levers work in tandem with each other as well. Again, that's my particular poison, you know. So if I'm coming into a period of considerable stress, the first thing I'll do is stop drinking alcohol. That's just like one of the first things. Like I know it's going to be a really full on time. Not a huge drinker anyway, but it just means like just don't drink for a few weeks while we're going through this period. It means less alcohol, it means more sleep and less caffeine as a lever. You know, the other things from a very basic level, get better at sitting with yourself. And, you know I was talking before about PTSD contraindications and trauma, contraindications, but it could just look like just writing a few lines down. I think of it as data, like internal data from the CPU. Like we're really looking at, like, where are you at today? Are you tired? Are you excited? Are you overstimulated? Just giving yourself little scores or just writing a little paragraph about where you're at for the day. It's just a good check-in process.
But it's
it's
self-awareness driving, isn't it? Whether it's journaling or doing some sort of a checklist, it's like, oh, actually, how am I feeling? Because often people just bundle through
stuff. You wouldn't notice.
Mm.
Yeah. And then, I think the other part of it is, adding to that a mindfulness practice, whether that's listening to a guided meditation, doing a walking meditation, doing a more formal sit where you're just looking at yourself. And then writing, how do I feel after that? What have I noticed happens there? And then the other kind of, it's not hack, I suppose, but one of the really lovely ways to engage with this in a physical sense, and I've found a lot of power in these physical movements, is breath techniques. So you don't have to go into full like Kapalabhati, skull shining breath kind of, extremes, or even Wim Hof kind of extremes. You could literally just do box breathing. You could breathe in for 4 and then out for 6. And just
I'm a big fan of
that's my favorite one.
Yeah. And I much prefer that, because when you breathe in, your sympathetic nervous system temporarily upregulates. It's the breath out on the parasympathetic nervous system. If you'd have asked me about breathwork 10 or 15 years ago, I'd have said it's fluffy bullshit touted by the crystal waving brigade. But now I'm a crystal waver right now. I'm
crystal.
Yes, I'm so all over breathwork. I actually think that breath control is an absolutely fundamental tool for both well-being and for peak performance. And elite athletes use it, special forces guys use it, and they don't do fluff bullshit, right? They do stuff that has...
That's it. Or like opera singers. I mean, I come from a singing background. Like, even recognizing before I go on stage, I'm still a bit of a nervous speaker, like doing public speaking and things like that. I get nervous. I was a bit nervous to talk to you, and you just learn to be able to regulate your breath and regulate yourself internally. It's actually a very, very powerful technique.
And actually awareness of breath as well. I think the more breath work you do, the more you start to become aware of it. And then people will start to notice that when they're stressed, they might shallow breathe, they might hold their breath, right? A lot of people will hold their breath whenever they're stressed. And that shit ain't good for your physiology, right? But
the amount of times that you go into a workshop and I'll just do a little bit of breath work, and you often say to someone, is this the first deep breath you've taken today? And you just see them go, like just the relief on people's, we don't know. We're just trying to get through. I mean, let's be honest, especially since lockdowns, especially in Melbourne where I'm based, like we've had a few pretty rough years, and I think, yes, we're getting by. And it's time to look more at a flourishing time, a thriving time, than just surviving. And I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of helping people move more into that state of more awareness, asking for what they need and creating the circumstances, the organizations, the communities that really nourish and support humans to be their best. And that doesn't look like, revving out these Formula One engines. It looks like having a balanced and healthy and integrated life.
Yeah, absolutely. Touche, Megan. Now, I know you've got to run because you got something to go to, but thank you for sharing all of that. And so where can people go to learn more about what the centre does, and if they want to bring them into the workplace or do the online programs, those sorts of things? And then you personally, if they want to book you as a speaker or follow you on socials.
Yay. So it is the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. So if you just search Monash M3CS, that's usually the easiest way to find it. You can also look up Monash Training for Humanity. You can find me at meganflamer.com. I also write a little Substack newsletter, which is a bit of fun. It's really me looking at what happens when I pull these levers on myself. So it's sort of my guinea pig newsletter. So that's at Substack, and it's just called Excited Adult, because I feel like that's why I'm alive, to discover why adults maintain excitement when they get older. Yeah, and you can find me on like Instagram, Twitter, and things like that. Are we still using Twitter? I don't know. I haven't checked it, but certainly always up for a chat about mindfulness and wisdom and contemplation. I think that's why we're here, to understand that.
Megan, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your contemplation, and thank you for the unexpected little little rabbit hole into the world of ayahuasca and other shamanic modalities. It was very fun.
Oh, very, very fun, Paul. Thanks so much for your time.